Hey, everybody, good afternoon and welcome. This is Anthony D'Ambrosio from Supply Chain Solutions, and you are listening to the Ship Show Series podcast, the show that gives you the inside angle on all things related to supply chain, logistics, and beyond. Today's March 7th, 2024, and on this week's show, everyone, it's that time again. It's all about the FMR, the Freight Market Roundup. So let's dive in and find out what's going on with the global and domestic market conditions. But before we do, I'd like to talk high level about four or five quick things before we get into some trends to watch as we go around the world and back and go through the United States to go over the market conditions. So now that we are out of the Chinese Lunar New Year, we are in what's known as the slack season. And the slack season brings some temporary relief with pricing, okay? But rate negotiations and potential disruptions are still remaining in focus and are sort of in the background right now. So let's talk about the market right after Chinese New Year. So the market has begun to shift after the Chinese New Year run up of volume, combined with the impact of the Red Sea disruptions and the ongoing missile attacks by the Houthi rebels, as well as the continued Panama Canal constraints. It's really become a big issue for everyone in global shipping. Now, the timing left shippers having to route cargo through the Trans Pacific eastbound strings that are discharged at the West Coast ports of the USA and Canada, adding to the traditional surge prior to the holiday. Now, combining with carriers and carrier void sailings, periods of tight space, container rolling, and increased transshipment routings, the ocean freight rates have really significantly increased, while delays and congestion have mounted. So again, it's that vicious cycle. Rates increase a little bit, they dip a little after Chinese New Year, but we're already hearing that there could be some new increases on the March 15th NRAs and rate guideline periods. Is that going to happen on 315? Are they going to extend the rates out to the end of the month, to the end of March? Okay. It's really unknown at this point. So we're trying to keep our fingers on the pulse of that. But I think after the Chinese New Year holiday, space out of Asia to the US appears to be less challenging on the Trans-Pacific eastbound trades, and rates have started dropping from the peak volumes that we saw early in February. Now, the measurement of rate reductions will be in focus in the coming weeks. And with only 2 months left in the current Trans-Pacific eastbound contract season, when most annual contract rates expire on April 30th, the market versus carrier strategies leading into the contract negotiation period will be a key factor, especially as ocean carriers try to maintain higher levels as long as possible. And, the ocean carriers are always looking to increase rates, but they're really trying to figure this out and figure out which way they're going to go. I am of the opinion that the rates are going to continue to go up with all these disruptions happening. Now, one of the other things that's really important is what's going on with the Red Sea. Now, the focus remains on the continued impact of the longer transits around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa to reach Europe and U.S. East Coast ports, which continues to impact the carriers on a global basis, especially a global cost basis, and where increases have been distributed amongst many trade lanes worldwide to compensate. So you have to keep in mind, folks, these longer transit times around the Cape of Good Hope cost the carriers more money in diesel fuel and low sulfur fuel. There's so many expenditures that they have that increases their operating costs, and of course they want to pass that on to you, the consumer, and to us, the NVOCC and freight forwarder. So ocean freight rates remain on the higher side compared to the fourth quarter of 2023. as ocean carriers continue to subsidize the longer transit with more capacity and are having to pay more per vessel as a result, such as fuel. That's one instance. So ocean carriers appear stalled at the moment, trying to determine the future schedules of all these cost models. They're really not sure which way to go. And this is what our boots on the ground are telling us here at Supply Chain Solutions. And some are building models that represent a minimum 6 months window of continued transit around the Cape of Good Hope versus the Suez Canal routing. So that's an important point, and this is why I wanted to talk about this high level, because carriers are really saying, hey, we're going to be sailing around the Cape of Good Hope for another 6 months until this is all, put to bed and there's no more threats in the Red Sea from the Houthi rebels, you know. So it's a really crazy situation right now. And in anticipation that current levels will continue for quite some time, and before there is little or no risk transiting back through the Suez Canal, the carriers are not going to go back and transit through the Suez Canal. Now, the previous overflow of capacity, as well as non-performing capacity in various trade lanes, were quickly absorbed in the Asia to Europe trade due to the Red Sea situation. And it is said that new ship deliveries, in particular the ultra large vessel types, these are vessels that hold 14,500 TEU, that's 20-foot equipment units or larger, will likely be commissioned into this trade. And an ocean carrier that we spoke to noted that an additional 30% of space is still needed to accommodate the longer transit and the increased frequency of sailings around the Cape of Good Hope routing, or routing, to keep the service performance at an optimal level. And this is something we hear all the time here. Our director of pricing North America, Jen Elsenbrook, and her team, who do an amazing job, working with all of our carriers. This is something the carriers are always pushing back on the freight forwarding community, saying, hey, if you want us to keep, our performance levels and our operating levels up to par, you have to pay more right now because it's costing us more. So while the impact has been minimal thus far, there is really a concern by some of the analysts that we've spoken to that as long as the Red Sea conflicts continue, equipment imbalances will increase over time, and container shortages should really become problematic in the future, because a lot of these vessel owners are not repositioning those empty containers to the ports that they need to go back to, so they can be reloaded. So it's a real fly in the ointment, folks. Now, one of the other major things that I want to talk about high level is the potential disruption that is on the horizon that could have a direct impact to the U.S. supply chains later this year. Now, the International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA, contract with the United States Maritime Alliance, the USMX, will expire on September 30th this year. Now, the ILA chapters have been given a deadline of mid-May to negotiate on local port matters before the focus is then put on the larger contract issues, such as wages, which is said to be the catalyst in trying to agree to a new 6-year contract. And really, both sides remain far apart. And should the negotiations take a similar course as the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union on the West Coast, that are affiliated with the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association, we could really have a crazy contract dispute, in front of us. And you have to keep in mind that ILWU contract dispute took over 15 months before ratification last August. So it's very possible that major disruptions could take place, and at a very critical time during the shipping season. Now, shippers are really going to have no choice but to plan well ahead and potentially divert cargo through West Coast ports as a precaution to ensure reliable and timely delivery of goods. And if everyone remembers, Jason and I spoke about that towards the end of last year, that we saw this coming down the pike, that volume from that had shifted to the East Coast during the ILWU dispute last year is now going to shift back to the West Coast. So, um, again, it's a really big fly in the ointment. Now, shippers really have no choice but to plan well ahead. And this cargo is definitely going to have to divert through the West Coast as a precaution. Now, the impact could be significant as the throughput volume will really pressure West Coast ports in the US and Canada to accommodate these increases in volume. So, again, we're really going to have to keep a close eye on this. And furthermore, the added volume through the West Coast could strain the U.S. railroad system, with more cargo moving to the U.S. East Coast and Gulf Coast final destinations, in addition to the normal flow of cargo that moves into the interior, predominantly into the Midwest region. As everyone knows, Chicago is that major central rail hub in the Midwest. So if you remember last year, it was taking maybe 10 to 14 days to go from the West Coast to Chicago by rail. And sometimes these rails didn't even budge for days. Containers and 53-foot, trailers that are on these rails, they just sat because of the congestion was so bad. So everything from port and rail ramp congestion, rail car shortages, and overall days is in the mix, and this could be experienced. So ocean freight rates will very likely be driven up by this potential disruption with the ILA contract negotiations, and it's really going to impact supply and demand scenarios, and there's going to be a lot of unforeseen challenges. And I can tell you, everyone, having been born and raised in Philadelphia and being a Philly boy and grew up in this industry working in the ports of Philadelphia and South Jersey, the ILA is a great organization, but, they are real serious about these negotiations. And, again, it's something we're really going to have to keep our fingers on the pulse on. Now, the last thing I want to talk about high level before we go into the trends to watch is the ocean carrier alliances. So one thing that people may have already read about in some of the trade community publications is that Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd announced the formation of the new Gemini Alliance, which will start in January of 2025. Now, Hapag-Lloyd will be leaving the alliance, which they are currently part of, by the end of January 2025. And the alliance members currently are Hapag-Lloyd, O&E, which is one, HMM, which is Hyundai Merchant Marine, and Yangming Lines. So they're trying to reassure the market that business will continue as usual for 2024, but this will mean significant changes and disruptions to the vessel services in early 2025, because having dug a little bit deeper and did a little bit more research, you have to keep in mind, folks, that there are a couple of major transshipping points out of the Far East, that being Busan, Korea, and Singapore. So a lot of these feeder vessels go into Busan, they go into Singapore, and then they load their containers on what we call the mother vessel, okay, that heads to the EU, that heads to the USA, that heads to destinations down in Latin America. And Maersk and Hapag are going to restrict the amount of vessel strings and transshipment loadings out of these two areas. So that's really going to be, again, a real fly in the ointment that we're going to have to watch on, which I think is going to create a lot of volatility. Now that we went through those high-level trends, let's just go rapid fire on some trends to watch coming down the pike. So let's start off with some air freight news in the global market. So there has been a strong surge in tonnages at the Asia-Europe sea air hubs. And for most of you out there who are not familiar with this sort of shipping, a lot of people ship sea air. So, you know, they may pick up cargo in one country and then send it by air, by ocean, typically less than container loads, and then it will go into another major country where they're loaded on an aircraft because they want to increase their turnaround time. So they ship it partially by sea and partially by air. So in recent weeks, we've seen a notable increase in air cargo volumes at key Asia Europe sea air hubs such as Dubai and Colombo and Bangkok. And this is all being driven by the shippers seeking alternatives to container shipping because of the disruptions in the Red Sea and having to sail around the Cape of Good Hope. Another thing we want to look at is the significant year on year growth. And the analysis highlights that the year on year increase in air cargo tonnages to Europe from Dubai is up plus 71%. At Colombo, it's up 61%. In Bangkok, up 58% in the first 7 weeks of 2024. And this is significantly outpacing growth at other hubs like Singapore and Doha, Qatar. Another thing we want to look at is the impact of Lunar New Year timing. And the later occurrence of the Lunar New Year this year, and it happened much later this year in 2024, complicates week by week comparisons, but it also underscores a clear pattern of increased tonnages from these hubs to Europe. And despite this, the impact on pricing remains uncertain due to various factors, including market-wide declines from the previous year. So it's something we really need to keep the watch on. And then also, we want to look at the seasonal demand fluctuation. So post-Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, there's a traditional decline in demand from Asia Pacific. And it usually affects the global air cargo tonnages and rates. However, there's a structural improvement in demand compared to the previous year, with specific regions like the Middle East and South Asia experiencing tonnage and rate increases that are just going through the roof right now, reflecting the shift from ocean freight to sea air solutions. So that's another interesting tidbit there. And then lastly, on the air trends, global air cargo trends. I mean, overall, despite the slight year-on-year decrease in worldwide tonnages for weeks 6 and 7 this year, structural improvements in demand levels are evident, notably with the worldwide air cargo capacity, which has increased, and that is significant as it rises from Asia Pacific, Middle East, and South Asia. And that is really a big indication that there has been a robust recovery and an adaptation within the air cargo community to the ongoing logistics challenges with all these global disruptions and these sort of black swan events that affect global shipping. So again, let's go rapid fire now on ocean and the India subcontinent to North America. And that India subcontinent is countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Nepal. And believe it or not, there's a lot of freight that moves in and out of Nepal, even though it's a landlocked country. So just to go through that real quick, rates have been reduced in the second half of February, even though there was a GRI. So they implemented the GRI, and the GRI was actually, an overall reduction, if you can believe it. And carriers had initially posted a March 1st GRI of $1,000 a container, but as of this week, they postponed it until the second half of March without any changes to the market. But there is a GRI that will be in effect very soon. And I have heard from at least one carrier, and that carrier is Hapag-Lloyd, that they will implement a GRI from the India subcontinent to the USA, Middle East, and to Canada. And this will be effective on March 15th. So, this GRI is going to affect all dry containers or reefer containers and non-operating reefer containers. If you have a tank shipment, a flat rack, or an open top container, you could look at anywhere from $480 on a 20 to $600 across the board on a 40-foot standard high cube or reefer container. The space, there are some vessel delays in getting to the destination and back to the origin, which are resulting in a lack of capacity. But these are only short-term disruptions at the moment. And I think when we think of equipment, although there is equipment availability, it's carrier specific for each loading point. So we're finding that, this is essentially true with the inland container depots and the smaller, less connected ports, especially in India, where there's sometimes a major issue with repositioning containers and equipment availability. Now, let's try to go real quick, rapid fire through the ocean freight, Far East westbound. So within the Red Sea, this remains unresolved, as I mentioned to you earlier, as most vessels are continuing to reroute via the Cape of Good Hope, and this is adding 2 to 4 weeks on the transit time. So the vessel schedules are really going to continue to fluctuate, everyone. And as a result, as I mentioned just a little while ago, expect regional equipment shortages, which are going to occur in some of the Asian ports. Now, demand has softened as expected after the Lunar New Year holiday, but bookings have also slowed and they are down in week 9. But we expect this to pick up from week 11 onwards as role pools have been created over the past weeks because vessel utilization is positive at the moment and carriers are continuing to assess capacity and rates. So even though, many of us have all these great contracts with many of the container lines, right now the spot rate market is outpacing the contract market. And if a container line, so if our contract rate, say from Shenzhen to New York is, $5,000, if somebody offers 5,200 for that same trade lane that doesn't have a contract, that carrier may elect to give that space to the person that doesn't have a contract that's willing to pay a little bit more. So it's a vicious cycle. And again, on the rate development. So, with respect to rate developments, as the Red Sea situation continues to impact capacity and equipment, carriers are upholding rates via GRIs and peak seasons and contingency charges. However, there is pressure and questions about the amount of the additional cost of rerouting via the Cape of Good Hope. So the FMC is watching this closely. So thank God for Big Brother, and the FMC was keeping their finger in the pulse of this. But expectations are that the peak season quantums are really going to be mitigated or even dropped in March. So again, it's really going from week to week, folks, and rates are expected to go down as of March 1st, which they have, and they will continue to decline going forward due to low demand. But we're just going to have to keep our fingers on the pulse of that for that ocean freight business moving from the Far East that's going westbound. Now let's go out to the United States now and go to North America and just do a quick blitz here. So in the southeast of the USA in Savannah, the Georgia ports have advised they are experiencing a severe backlog in Nashville and Nashville-bound intermodal containers on the dock. A lot of this is due to the winter weather conditions in Nashville. Apologies about that, folks, as well as the shortage of chassis. In Atlanta, there are considerable challenges and congestion at some of the rails in Atlanta, in the Atlanta market, with long dwell times, which are usually due to inoperable cranes. And right now, there's a major problem down at the Port of Savannah because carriers have only been able to schedule pre-mounted containers because the drivers cannot sit idle waiting for a live mount to load containers or discharge containers. And with containers only having a 24-hour free time, carriers are not able to get appointments, causing increases in rail storage and demurrage because of these inoperable containers. Now, down in Jacksonville, SSA Marine, which is the terminal operator, has reached the halfway point in a $72 million project to expand and modernize the Jacksonville container terminal. So they're going to have 6 new outbound truck lanes, and they are currently also under construction and scheduled to open at the end of March. And there will be additional improvements to the terminal's 6 inbound lanes, scheduled for completion later this year. And up in the Northeast, specifically Norfolk, there have not been many issues with port congestion in Norfolk, and how funny is that, right? You know, finding somewhere where we're not having a lot of issues. Carriers are having issues with congestion and getting containers returned at the Pinner's Point Empty Container Yard, but that is mild considered to some of the other disruptions going on around the country. But they are also still being challenged with scheduling and appointments to the vessels slipping out. And then as we come home and take it home and close this out in the central Ohio Valley, out in Columbus, wait time in the rails have returned to a more normal 1 to 2 hours. Chassis availability fluctuates week to week depending on the train schedules, and the 20-foot chassis have been harder to come by. But overall, Columbus isn't doing too bad, and mounting containers at the CXX rail terminal can usually take about 1 to 3 hours. So truckers are still reporting issues at the Norfolk Southern terminal for containers arriving, but only becoming available on the last free day, which is really a vicious cycle because your containers not coming available to that last day of free time. So you hope you can get in to get your container without being charged, demurrage. So it's a really crazy situation, and the flexi chassis are in very short supply. So if you're not familiar with those flexi chassis, one of these days, Jason and I will do a whole show on chassis and container sizes, and we'll go through the whole gambit. But out in Minneapolis, St. Louis, and Kansas City, there are still some backups from winter weather and freezing temperatures in the region from earlier this year, but most operations are back to normal capacity. And the Minneapolis market has seen an influx of container volume, but it still has plenty of carrier capacity in the market to service these increases. And lastly, the West Coast. Out in Los Angeles, at the Port of Los Angeles, despite the lower volumes at the Port of Los Angeles, carriers are still reporting issues with securing appointments for slots at the container terminal. So I know that was a whirlwind blitz of high-level talking points as well as global market and domestic market conditions. That's it for our FMR today, for our Freight Market Roundup. Next week, we have a great show. We have Matt Young from Avison Young on our show with Jason and I. Jason will be back next week. He's been on paternity leave. So again, we send out a shout to Jason, his new arrival, and his lovely wife, Lizzie. And we're going to have a great show next week. I can't wait for Jason to come back. I really miss Jason, and I'm sure you guys are hearing me, getting a little tired hearing me talk so much. So again, make it a great day. Enjoy the rest of your week. And remember, Supply Chain Solutions, the company that always finds a better way. And God bless America. Have a great day, everyone.